So I was just curious. I was just thinking, I know pretty much everyone here is quite familiar with Ayn Rand. So I'm just curious, the first time you ever read Ayn Rand, if you had to describe like what you got from that in one word, what would that be? Okay, validation. Enlightenment. Heroism. Inspiration. Clarity. What was? If you had anything else, just shout it.
Peace. Bewilderment.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, yours is interesting. The bewilderment is interesting. Because definitely for me, the number one thing I got was clarity. And I feel like clarity is in terms of just what's right and what's wrong and how to make sense of complex and controversial issues. I felt like there was, before I read Ayn Rand when I was 18, and then afterward. Actually, my first experience reading Ayn Rand was this book, which I might be the first person, I'm the only person I've ever met who discovered Ayn Rand through the book Letters of Ayn Rand. And I was basically procrastinating for a physics test when I was at Duke, and I was in the library, and for some reason, it was in '98, but for some reason on the new releases thing, they had Letters of Ayn Rand, and I had heard about Ayn Rand, and I knew that she was quite controversial. I knew she was pro-capitalism, and I tended to be pro-capitalism, and so I was very interested. It didn't take me much to not study for physics. Anyway, and the first thing that I got from her was just something that was so important to me at the time, which was she gave me clarity on the idea of conservative versus liberal. And I remember in high school, I was kind of brought up in a, what you call a liberal place. My parents were sort of moderate types, but I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland, and so most people were politically liberal, and in my high school, most people were politically liberal. And I started disliking that, particularly because it seemed anti-intellectual, individual responsibility. And so I started thinking of myself as a conservative, and then toward the end of high school, that wasn't quite working for me either. There seemed something off about that. And then I just remember it was really frustrating because the major kinds of views available, just none of them seemed particularly clear or coherent. And I remember picking up this book, Letters of Ayn Rand, and there was this passage in it, and she's writing to Barry Goldwater about his book, The Conscience of a Conservative. And I won't read the whole quote, but what she's doing is she's just challenging very directly that there is such a thing as a conservative philosophy. And what I think she's really doing is she's just challenging conservative and liberal as a false alternative and really incoherent. Like conservative, what does that mean? That just means you believe in whatever is old? Like it doesn't make any sense. It's only if what's old is good it makes sense to believe it. But then, and this is part of what's at the bottom of the quote, she talks about, a political system fundamentally different from any that had ever existed before, and then a system based on the concept of man's inalienable individual rights. And I just remember, wow, this is so much clearer. There's this idea of individual rights, and that's the thing that it makes sense to categorize yourself as for or against, not conservative or liberal, which is super vague. So I became just totally intrigued by her. I think prior to then, the clearest thinker I had found was a guy, probably many of you are familiar with, a guy named Thomas Sowell, an economist who's also a cultural commentator. But I just felt like, oh, this is a totally new level, and I just became really intrigued. And I was wondering, what is different about her analysis? And I'm going to give you how I'd explain it now, not how I'd explain it then. How I'd explain it then was just she seems to have a much better mind than other people. There's just something about her thinking. But I would put it now as she has a different framework than other people. And so when I talk about a framework, framework is a metaphor, but I think it's a very good metaphor. So with a building, you have a framework, which is your starting structure. And the starting structure of the building influences everything else about the building. And I think the exact same thing is true for a thought process or a conversation. When you begin a thought process, like if you're thinking about some issue in American politics, there are some premises, some kind of general mental units, mental entities or mental something you have in your mind that's going to affect how you process the controversy. And the way I think of it now is I often divide frameworks into three categories. You can definitely divide it other ways, but I think of it as often there are always, when we're thinking about something or talking about something, there are certain methods that we're using. There are certain, you can call them assumptions, but you can think of them as causal relationships, your convictions about how the world works. And then there are certain kinds of values. And what I was picking up on at the time when I was reading Ayn Rand was many of these things, but I think in particular I first picked up on her method. One thing is she was just very clear about concepts. So people would use a concept like conservative and liberal, and they would just throw it around and be super vague, and she would think, no, those don't really go together. Those aren't putting the right types of things together. I should think about reclassifying or reconceptualizing things. So I think of just some examples of what I think of in terms of some of the values of her ideas. These are just a small sample. And I think of it in the context of, I often will talk about a 3C issue. So an issue that's crucial and complex and controversial. And I'm really interested in these kinds of issues. That's part of why I got interested in the issue of fossil fuels, which is definitely all three of those. And I think that just so much of what she has figured out that I think is true just helps me so much in thinking clearly and in making good decisions about issues. So, for example, her method. So these are just, and I know we have different levels of familiarity, so not all of these might be familiar to everyone, but I think most of them will. So one is just classification by essentials versus package deals. So this is just part of how she views you should form a concept in a way that the things that you're uniting together are essentially the same, and you have a really clear purpose, and they all really fit together, versus a package deal are two sorts of things that don't really go together that you're artificially packaging together. So for example, when she talks about selfishness and how it's commonly used as a blend of both sacrificing others to yourself rather, and then pursuing your own benefit in a non-sacrificial way, in her views. Well, those don't go together. If you call both a dictator and a Howard Roark selfish, then it's just incoherent. You can't do anything with that concept. Another idea of hers is integration versus non-integration. So there's a lot to this, but one is just that all of your knowledge should be non-contradictory. So if you ever discover a contradiction between one idea and another, at most one of them is right, and maybe all of them are wrong. But you can't have two contradictory ideas that are both true. And then one of the key ideas of the Fountainhead, independent thinking versus second-handedness. So that the only real access you have to reality is your own mind, and so you need to use your own mind. You can deal with others, you can learn from others, but you can't be a mental parasite on others. Otherwise, you detach yourself from reality. So all of these things are just, I just find incredibly helpful all the time. And in terms of causal relationships, and reason is man's basic tool of survival. I'm going to talk more about this one later. I think this is just such an important thing in understanding so much of the world, and particularly if you're thinking about anything economic, if you get that, ultimately it's reason that is at the root of everything, then you know that, among other things, you want a system that allows people to use their reasoning as much as possible and to make use of their reasoning. And then, one of her controversial ideas, reason is volitional and causal. So we have free will, but it has a definite nature. It's not some sort of random, causeless type of thing. And then reality is objective. This is definitely one of the ideas that early on appealed to me and just made sense, that reality is the way it is, whatever your dreams, wishes, hopes, fears, whatever, that doesn't change the nature of reality. And then in terms of the category of values, one is selfishness. So the individual's life should be his highest value. Capitalism is moral. Industrialization is moral. So early on, insofar as I agreed with what Ayn Rand said, and I agreed a lot, I found her ideas incredibly clarifying, and I find them even much more clarifying 20 years later, and having tried to apply them in different kinds of ways and try to apply them to understand a lot of difficult kinds of issues. But then there's an interesting thing and I think many of you have probably had similar experiences. Then there's a question of how does this apply to clarifying issues for others? Because I think this is often almost a paradox where people have the experience of, I read Ayn Rand and I feel really clear about some issue myself, but then when I try to explain it to somebody else using these ideas, it can often backfire. So it's an interesting question to ask. How helpful are objectivist ideas for helping others clarify their thinking about crucial, complex, controversial issues? And an observation I've made is that sometimes it seems very helpful, it's definitely very helpful, and sometimes it's very unhelpful. So take the example of, let's say I'm talking to somebody about their career. And somebody is, you talk to any young person about their career and they're just being bombarded with a million different kinds of influences, including a lot of what I would regard as self-sacrificial influences. So I'm just imagining, somebody is being told maybe and this did not happen in my case, by the way, but like their mom is telling them to be a rabbi and, they're getting that kind of pressure. And then they're like hearing, do what you love and just all these different things. But a lot of it is, oh, maybe you should have a more meaningful life. You should join the Peace Corps. And so one thing I might think is that what would really help them is if I try to explain the issue in terms of selfishness. Because for me, that would be very helpful. When I think of my own career, I have a certain view of selfishness, and it's very helpful to think in terms of, I want a selfish career. I want a career that really benefits me, and then part of my conception of how it benefits me is that I create a lot of value and I exchange that with others, so it benefits everyone I deal with too. But definitely, I want to be selfish. But what do you think would happen if I'm talking to a high school student and they're getting all this stuff and they say, hey, what do you think? And then I just say, well, you would agree, right? You just have to make the most selfish decision. What do you think they would say? That would maybe they would be intrigued. I would hope that I would be intrigued in high school, but it might be off-putting and it would be very confusing. It actually wouldn't help them think clearly about the issue, not if I just said that as my first thing. But if I took another objectivist idea, or at least an element of another objectivist idea, which would be independent thinking, and I said, okay, well, one thing is you're hearing all of these things. One thing that might be useful, and that I found useful, is that no matter what, you need to think this through for yourself. Nobody else has all the information that you have. You know yourself better. Even there are things you don't know better, but you have to figure that out for yourself. It's just the only way you're going to make a good decision is to think independently about it. In my experience, if I make that point to somebody, that will make sense to them, and not only will it make sense to them, but it has an effect that I've talked about if you've heard me talk about framing before, whereas if you frame the conversation with an idea that's really coherent to somebody, then it improves their thinking. So if I get somebody to say, yeah, I agree that I should think about this independently, then the rest of the conversation, they will think more independently. So if we start with independent thinking and then we move on to, and then something comes up and they say, oh, but my mom said this, but I say, okay, but do you understand that for yourself, or are you just taking it secondhand from her? And the person can say, oh yeah, right, she needs to explain it to me. I can't just take it on faith. So it actually, if you get somebody an idea that they do agree with, then it can really help clarify the issue. But if you give them another kind of idea, then it can actually impede your ability to clarify the issue. So I'm just curious, what's going on here? Why is it sometimes helpful and sometimes not? If you just think about trying to use objectivist ideas to clarify things. Anyone have any thoughts?
Depends on the context of the person you're talking to.
Okay, you just answered it right there. So I'm not going to take any more answers. She said it depends on the context of the person you're talking to. And so one way I'll think of it is and this is, I'm talking about objectivist ideas because I think that's a commonality among a lot of us here that we're interested in those ideas. But this applies to any ideas that you believe are true. Framing a conversation with a given idea is incredibly clarifying if the idea is understood or easily understandable by another person. So as you said, they have, to use your terminology, they have the context to understand it. So if somebody has the context, if they're pretty close to grasping that independent thinking is a good thing, if it doesn't take them that much or it doesn't take them anything, then you can give them the power of that concept, and then you can work with it in the rest of your explanation. As I'll talk about later, you can build on it. But if you give them an idea that's controversial and difficult to understand in the moment, then the framing creates confusion. So an obvious kind of example of this is that if you say, like let's say you were even trying to explain independent thought, and you said, well, I want to, I think it's really important to be independent. For example, like independent thought helped me discover that abortion should be legal. So what's wrong with that? That could be true, but it's that the idea, you're using a super controversial idea to try to prove another idea. So you haven't actually clarified it, you've just introduced more confusion. Now today, the title of my talk is the Human Flourishing Framework. And so what the Human Flourishing Framework is I only realized this a lot later after coming up with it. But what I call the Human Flourishing Framework is basically a set of ideas. They're mostly philosophical ideas, and a lot of them are in one way or another derived from objectivism. Some of them might be my own, but it's a set of ideas that are understood or easily understandable by other people that can help them achieve a lot of clarity. So, and it's come particularly with the fossil fuel issue, which is what I'm going to talk about next. But it's a set of ideas that are relatively common sense, but not common practice. And when I look at a lot of the success I've had in helping people think clearly about things, I've realized a lot of what I've been able to do is take certain things in philosophy and take the things in philosophy that are easiest to understand and use those first and help people build clarity from that and then build to more complex and controversial things. But it turns out that even if you take ideas that are pretty common sense to people, it's amazing how much clarity they can get. So I'm going to talk about today how it can itself create a lot of clarity, and it's also a great starting point. And when I talk about the Human Flourishing Framework, it's really my own framework, and it's primarily what I use for industrial type issues. And what I'm going to encourage at the end is that you, for your own purposes, have your own framework. It might be of different frameworks for different issues, but you think about what are the ideas that are really clarifying that people can also pretty easily grasp, and that's a good starting point for to help them think about the issue. So I want to talk about then how what I'm calling the Human Flourishing Framework has helped me clarify the issue of fossil fuels for myself and also for a lot of other people. So fossil fuel is definitely a 3C issue in the sense of being complex, crucial, complex, and controversial. I mean, essentially you have, if you just learn sort of anything about fossil fuels, like just study it a little bit, you find, oh my gosh, every single thing we do in civilization uses fossil fuels, because basically everything uses technology, and all technology is powered by some form of energy, and fossil fuels are by far the dominant form of energy, and even with the forms of energy that aren't fossil fuels, they're hugely powered and made possible by fossil fuels. So you have this thing that is completely essential to life as we know it, and then is also being attributed with ending life as we know it. So I would call that is a complex thing to wrap one's head around. And there are a lot of, I think objectivist ideas can help clarify anything, and there are a lot of kinds of ideas that I've learned from objectivism that can help clarify this issue, but they are not a good starting point in helping them clarify the issue. So for instance, capitalism, selfishness, and private infrastructure. So if I just take private infrastructure, which is definitely something I believe in, that it's proper and extremely beneficial if we have property rights and infrastructure can be, leaving aside military stuff, but can be built by individuals. And so I believe that you can have things like private roads, and I think that's better to have, and I think that you have much more innovation that way. And I think that can help guide energy policy. For example, it could help how we deal with pipelines and how we deal with rail. And so it's helped my thinking, but if I'm trying to take somebody who's just completely confused by this issue and I say, well, as you know, all infrastructure should be private, that's going to just be completely off-putting because they don't have the context for it. And it's context, but it's important that it is context at a certain point. So if society gets to the point where they have a really good ideas about energy, they're going to need to know, hey, how do you actually put these into practice fully? Like, how do we handle an electric grid? So it's not an irrelevant idea. It's just not the right introductory idea. And same thing with selfishness. If I say, well, we should do everything selfishly, so we should use fossil fuels selfishly, that's not going to clarify, it's not going to confuse. But I just say, well, yeah, as we know, capitalism is totally moral, and fossil fuels are part of capitalism, or fossil fuels should exist under capitalism. That itself is just going to be too much because the person doesn't have the context. But there are also a lot of, I'm calling objectivist ideas, but really true fundamental ideas that are relatively common sense that can be enormously clarifying. And over time, I've realized that insofar as I've helped people think clearly, what I've done is I've framed the issue with these kinds of ideas. So I'm just going to give you some examples. And my goal is not to give you the full moral case for fossil fuels, but to show you how framing it with these elements of the human flourishing framework can be incredibly clarifying for people. So one thing is, when I talk to people, I'll observe that when we're looking at anything, I'll ask them, doesn't it make sense that we shouldn't look at just the negative context? So if we're looking at like fossil fuels and solar and different kinds of technologies, we shouldn't just look at the negatives of one and the positives of another. We should look at the positives and negatives of both. So I'll talk about we shouldn't look at the negative context, we should look at the full context, and there are some different elements of that. Oh, sorry. We'll get to Jimmy Fallon in a second. So I'll observe, for example, like that we often talk about negatives of fossil fuels, but we don't really take seriously in our thinking that there's something about the fossil fuel industry that is uniquely good at producing energy. It's no accident that like in every prosperous country in the world, they are dominated by fossil fuels. And the thing is that is the industry that has really figured out how to profitably produce energy, which means that they can produce energy. And I won't necessarily explain this to the person at the time, but I'll just say that there's clearly something that they can do positively. And if we ignore that, then we're going to make a bad decision. And almost everyone will agree with that. Like, we shouldn't be biased. We should look at the pros and cons of everything. But it turns out so that's a pretty common sense idea, but it's not common practice at all. I mean, almost nobody looks at fossil fuels in an even-handed way. They look at it in a biased way. But if I frame the issue in a certain way, if I make the issue explicit, so if I say, hey, do you agree that this should be part of our framework, or do you agree that we should base our thinking on this idea, then they will agree, because it's almost impossible to disagree with, and then their thinking will improve. And so this is just a funny little clip, but this is kind of Jimmy Fallon pointing to, there's something a little bit, he doesn't know it, but he's pointing to something that's a little bit biased in how we think about green energy, because we think about green energy as, it must be cheap because it comes from the sun. And like what he points out, he doesn't point it out for solar and wind, but he points it out for a different kind of green energy, which is hazelnut energy.
New Scientist magazine reported on Wednesday that in the future, cars could be powered by hazelnuts. That's encouraging, considering an 8-ounce jar of hazelnuts costs about $9. Yeah, I got an idea for a car that runs on bald eagle heads and Fabergé eggs.
So this is an example of, we need to look at the full context. We need to look at the costs of the whole process to produce every form of energy, hazelnut energy, solar energy, whatever. We can't just look at, the sun is free, and then on one side, and then look at all the costs of fossil fuels on the other. It doesn't make any sense. Another aspect of looking at the full context that I think is really powerful to frame an issue around is the issue of precision versus sloppiness. So for example, this is kind of a technical issue, but you'll often hear that, in Germany, they have, you'll hear sometimes in energy, people talk about capacity, like, we have X% of capacity from solar. And capacity is deliberately a very sloppy term, because capacity is like the maximum theoretical potential of a power source. But let's say if you're running nuclear power operates continuously at 90% of capacity, whereas solar and wind operate sometimes at 100% of capacity and often at 0% of capacity, and so they don't have anywhere near the utility as a reliable source of power. So when people talk about, I have 100 megawatts of nuclear and 100 megawatts of solar, that is completely sloppy. Those don't mean the same thing. That's like apples to rotten oranges. But people are being sloppy about it. But the point here is, if I point out, hey, do you agree that we should be precise versus sloppy, that can really help people's thinking, and then they'll start to think in a more precise way. Another one with sloppiness is sea level rise. I'll point out, like I'll often give the thing, do you agree we should be precise about sea level rise? So if somebody says sea levels are rising, do you agree that it makes sense to differentiate between Al Gore, who says that we're gonna have a 20-foot sea level rise in the near future, versus say the UN, which says that it's gonna rise 2 feet over the next 100 years, right? Those are totally different things. And if you're not precise about which version you mean, then you can't weigh costs and benefits at all well. So let's talk about assumptions, because there are a lot of assumptions or different views of cause and effect that I think there are wrong views of it that are contaminating people's thinking, but those wrong views are very easily challenged. So one of the key ones that comes up in all industrial environmental issues is what I call the delicate nurturer view of the planet. And this is the view that nature is stable and safe and it's sufficient. So you'll often hear, oh, the earth, we've ruined our pristine earth, and you'll often hear about Mother Earth. And like, well, no, in reality, that's not the way Earth works at all. That's why we historically had a life expectancy of 30. There's no Garden of Eden. We weren't born in the Garden of Eden. We live in a planet that has wild potential. So it has amazing potential, but it's dynamic, it's dangerous, and it's deficient. So it's a dangerous place to live. And from the perspective of our modern standard of living, it's deficient. If we just leave it alone, then we will be very, very poor. And I find that this point, for a lot of people, takes maybe 20 to 30 seconds to explain, just to acknowledge, hey, the planet is not just this perfect Garden of Eden. It has a lot of potential, but it's also a really dangerous place that doesn't have a lot of resources unless we transform it. And most people will get that very quickly. But if I don't frame the issue, then they will completely operate on this delicate nurturer view. And even super sophisticated people, I would say most intellectuals in our country mostly use the delicate nurturer view when they talk about climate. That's why, for instance, when somebody hears, oh, like a polar bear had to move from one piece of ice to another, they have it in their mind, oh my gosh, the whole planet must be crumbling and we're gonna die, and so we really have to fix whatever is causing that polar bear issue, because they have this thing. But it's pretty easily dislodged, at least to a significant degree. And imagine how much better a conversation is going to be if we recognize, hey, we do need to transform nature. Impacting nature is not intrinsically bad, it's actually completely necessary, so we want to do it intelligently. Another related one is the belief that human beings on this delicate nurturing planet are polluter parasites. So all we do is we pollute, so we sully the pristine earth, and then we're parasites. We take the earth's precious resources. And I think now this is a really interesting one because it is so widespread and it's just completely false. It's, again, because nature doesn't give us a safe and clean planet that we make dangerous and dirty. It gives us a very dangerous and dirty from our perspective, all the disease and filth and all these different threats to our lives that we need to improve, we need to transform, but yet people just completely accept this polluter parasite view, even though they also know that we've gone from way less than 1 billion people with a 30-year life expectancy to 7 billion people with, whatever the average life expectancy is, probably 60 or so right now, and in the developed world, pushing 80. It's like they still have this view that, oh, we're polluter parasites and we somehow need to just refrain from impacting nature and then everything will be okay. It's just the most bizarre view, but people hold it, but they don't hold it in a very strong way. So if I give them the alternative, hey, no, actually what human beings do is what we really do. We don't always do our best, but we can perfect the earth. We can take a dangerous and dirty earth and we can actually make it safer and cleaner for our purposes, like improving sanitation. We can produce new value. We can turn useless glop into useful oil, or like useless metal into nuclear power. And I find even with this one, it only takes 30 seconds or a minute. It's not because there's so much evidence that it's right, but people will believe they're on the wrong framework unless you frame it correctly. And I noticed this with the oil industry because when I started looking at what's the oil industry saying about oil and the fossil fuel industry more broadly, what I noticed is whenever they talked about human impacts on what they would call the environment or our planet, they would only talk about negative ones. So they'd have an environmental impact report, and it would only be negatives. But yet, I know from a philosophical perspective, human beings, from a human perspective, can affect our environment negatively, but through industrialization, we primarily impact it positively. So you have all these companies that are making the world a much better place to live, and but the framework they're accepting makes them only think they make the world a worse place to live. But it's not that hard to dislodge. It's different than something like selfishness, which, given their context of knowledge, takes more explanation. So you get this kind of, this is just an example of somebody who's on this delicate nurturer, polluter, parasite premise. So John Holdren, this is somebody who predicted by 2020, carbon dioxide-induced famines would kill as many as 1 billion people. And what's actually happened is that billions of people are alive and better fed than ever, in large part because we have machine-driven agriculture powered overwhelmingly by diesel fuel, which is based on oil, and then also our whole modern fertilizer industry, which is completely crucial to modern agriculture, is based on natural gas. So this is just somebody who was following all the wrong frameworks, and somebody who's super, super smart, but he's just totally on the wrong framework. And maybe with John Holdren, it's not too easy to dislodge because his whole self-esteem is based on what I would call the anti-impact framework. But for most people, it's pretty easy to dislodge. So this is just an example of what's actually happened with not just with agriculture, just with climate. And if you've seen my work, you've probably seen this before, that as we've emitted more CO2 in the atmosphere, the percentage of people dying from climate-related deaths like storms and flood and heat and cold, that's gone way down. And the reason is you can only understand this if you understand that the planet is wild potential, because it's not that we had a safe climate and then we made it dangerous. It's we had a very dangerous climate and then we industrialized and we made it far safer. So the final category is values. So this is a huge one and it's related to the others. The dominant value that we hear about in environmental issues is being green, which means minimizing our environmental impact. And it doesn't take too long to challenge this and to have people grasp, no, wait, we should really be thinking of it not in terms of minimizing our environmental impact, but maximizing our flourishing. And I'll talk more about that concept in a minute because it's the center of how I like to frame things. So, but examples I like to use, which are pretty powerful, is, okay, if we had wanted to minimize our environmental impact and be as green as possible, should we have turned a patch of dirt and trees in the Northeast United States into New York City? So like if Greenpeace had been around, would they have given thumbs up or thumbs down to building New York? Yeah, so thumbs way down. And then, okay, so, and any other city, right? So if you're really trying to follow this value, it leads you toward no cities. Now, this is my symbol for children. I don't have any children yet, but this is me and my 3 sisters. And so my parents chose to have 4 children. They chose to have 3 children, and then the last 2 were twins. But still, if they were being as green as possible, would the Sierra Club, for instance, have endorsed, would they say, hey, you should self-replicate 1 or more times. If you want to minimize your environmental impact, you should make more of you. You should make more polluter parasites. No, that's the worst thing that you could do. Rough back the napkin calculation, it's much less environmental impact to live out of a running Hummer all the time than to have 1 child. And the Sierra Club tells people that, hey, you should actually, if you have 1 child, you're going to increase your carbon legacy, which is your carbon footprint going forward, by a factor of 6. So they're telling people don't have kids. And so when I make these points, people say, yeah, there's something wrong with this value of minimizing environmental impact. There's something there. We want a good environment, but this is not the way to get there. And then my favorite example is North Korea and South Korea. So which is a greener country, North Korea and South Korea? Which has less of an environmental impact? North Korea. Which has a nicer environment to live in? South Korea. So this gets to the idea that it's just totally wrong to think of the value as minimizing your environmental impact. The value is human flourishing, including a good environment. But you don't get a good environment by leaving the environment alone. You get a good environment by intelligently transforming it. So all of the points that I'm mentioning, they are points that each individual point, with at least a lot of people, they don't take that long to explain. People have a lot of knowledge that these points will quickly makes sense to them. Again, particularly if they're not just their self-esteem isn't wound up in having the other framework, but each one of these points I found incredibly clarifying to people. And it just totally shifts the focus. So one example I use a lot is that people, like when people are thinking in a kind of humanitarian way of, hey, what are the biggest problems on the earth, which I think there are problems with thinking about that, but there are legitimate senses of doing that. But nobody thinks about, hey, we talk about energy every day, but nobody thinks about, hey, you know what? 3 billion people on Earth have basically no energy, and 1 billion people have like literally zero electricity. And if you're concerned about human life, wouldn't that be something that you'd be concerned with? And I point out to people, we talk about energy every day. Energy is in the newspapers every day. And yet how often do people talk about lack of availability of energy? Almost never. But they talk about polar bears all the time. So what that shows is that if our value is not human flourishing and its minimum impact, then we're going to be obsessed with any change of conditions of the polar bears, but not truly concerned about the conditions of the human. And then, another example is of values in action is how when we think of different forms of energy, we don't think of what's the best energy. In other fields, we think of what's the best way to build something, what's the best smartphone, what's the best piece of software. But in energy, we don't think about the best energy, and best really means best for human flourishing. We think about, what's the most renewable, which is really a kind of word for natural. Like we want to have the most natural energy that impacts the environment the least somehow. And you can see that people think of nuclear as unnatural. And so they oppose nuclear, even though nuclear is a way better way of generating energy from every perspective, including, certainly including from a CO2 emissions perspective. So overall, I think of, with the issue of fossil fuels and with other industrial issues, I put together all these different kinds of ideas and some more ideas, these different kinds of methods and assumptions or beliefs about cause and effect and values. And that's what I think of as the human flourishing framework, because the core idea is that the top value is human flourishing, and then all of these other ideas help you discover what is necessary for human flourishing. So I'm just gonna scroll a few more. And then, so the conclusion that I draw in my book, and you can see all kinds of my stuff online, and if you actually put your email address on that sheet, then if you're not on my mailing list already, then you can get a whole bunch of information for yourself and also that you can share with others, both about my work on fossil fuels and also my podcast, The Human Flourishing Project. But this is kind of the takeaway of all of it, is that if you have this framework, I believe it's pretty straightforward that in the coming decades and really generations, we should be using more fossil fuels, not less, while always seeking out superior alternatives, including better ways of using fossil fuels under energy freedom. Now, this viewpoint is, unfortunately, is not yet taken over the world, but has influenced a lot of people, and it's in somewhat contradiction to the idea that I was told about 20 or 19 years ago when I got into Objectivism, which is that if you have these ideas, that's a market liability. And so this book in particular, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, this was something that was a New York Times bestseller, Wall Street Journal bestseller. Somebody misspelled bestseller, by the way. I have to admit that failure on my team. How that happened is a fascinating question. But and I've seen, it's been used by Department of Energy, Congress, the Senate, throughout. I get different references, and people in industry tell me all the time. I remember the Secretary of Energy gave a speech one day, and he said, I was talking about the morality of using fossil fuels and the immorality of restricting them, and I got that point from you, which is kind of a pretty cool thing. And it wasn't at all that Rick Perry and I agree on everything. Far from it. But I think I was able to help him think more clearly about the issue, and a lot of other people. I think the key of it is this idea of I'm really focused on how do I help people think more clearly, and I'm using the parts of my framework that will be most immediately useful. And then as I'll talk about it in a minute, I build toward more complex stuff. But I don't just say, well, I have an idea and I believe it, so I'm just going to start with that. Because if they don't have the context, it's not going to help anybody. And then our whole business has become, we're just a for-profit business, and our main business is helping companies and organizations be more persuasive. And so that's, even though I'm associated with controversial ideas, it's yet I also get paid to persuade regular people. And it's because if you take the right, quote, controversial ideas, they're actually very, very persuasive. And if you put them in the right order, you can persuade people of just about anything true. So I think the human flourishing framework, or at least some of the general ideas I've given today, can help clarify a lot of issues. Definitely all the high impact industries, so like plastics, industrial agriculture, nuclear power, all of those things, I think it obviously applies. And then by extension, I think it can also apply to all sorts of other issues, particularly this issue of human flourishing. The concept of human flourishing is very interesting in terms of its power, because what I really like about it is that it captures the integrated nature of human life. That's one thing. And then it's really focused on human benefit. So it's telling people that you should, it's focusing on, hey, we don't just kind of want to live to the next day or just have our heartbeat. We want to flourish, which means live to our highest potential. And that includes a mental and a material element to it. And so that's a really powerful idea. And then just, if you're talking about flourishing, you're talking about human beings benefiting. And so you think about, for instance, this issue of screen addiction. You have people talking about, we're all looking at our phones too much. And then, but at the same time, well, sometimes looking at our phones is really beneficial. And the idea of human flourishing says, yeah, well, what we really want is we want a policy toward our screens that will help us flourish. So it's just one little example where this concept could be very, very clarifying. And I hope that a lot of other people take as a starting point the idea of human flourishing, and that they apply it to other issues, and that they build their own framework around it in terms of what are the different kinds of methods and assumptions that will be most clarifying for things like AI and self-driving cars and all of these other things. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times that I believe in starting with ideas and with with methods and assumptions and values that people can most easily grasp, but then you can really build on that. So, and I'm working on this myself, I'm working on a new version of the moral case for fossil fuels, and one of my goals with the new version is I wanted to give more specific guidance on policy so that it can help more inform policy decisions. But what I've realized is that in order to do that, I need to build on it's not just enough to know that you need to look at the full context with even-handedness and precision. You have to have an idea of what are the right principles that will allow true human flourishing. And so I talk in the new version of the book, which is not out this year, it'll be out sometime next year, no release date currently announced, but that will have much more of a discussion of rights, because it's necessary to give a discussion of rights to help people make clear decisions about policy. But I don't just start out with, I believe in individual rights, here's how rights apply. The way I do it is I get the person to be focused on human flourishing, and then I show that, well, if we truly want human flourishing, that means that that ultimately means individuals have to flourish, and that ultimately means they need a non-sacrificial way of dealing with one another, and then here's how rights flows out of that. So it's by laying down the easier to explain parts of a framework, it's easier to build, versus starting off with the most controversial thing is not very helpful. And then with that example I gave before of selfishness and of talking to somebody about a career, I will talk to people about selfishness, but I have an awareness that in order to understand selfishness, they need to understand other premises first. And so one thing I find really helpful is that the more somebody understands that human beings survive by reason and production, so we're not predators, we don't really feed off each other, we actually benefit by dealing with each other, the more they get that there's a fundamental harmony of interests and that we can all live productively in harmony, then the more implausible it becomes that one should sacrifice. So the objectivist view of selfishness is totally wound up in the objectivist view of how human beings survive. So what I find is that the more I can get people to see, wow, this is what's possible, it's possible for human beings to live in a non-sacrificial way, then it almost becomes obvious that, yeah, you should live in a non-sacrificial way, and it would be completely unjust for you not to do that to yourself, and it would be unjust to others to demand that they not do that, and there's just no necessity. And then it makes the people who advocate sacrifice look pretty monstrous, because it's like, this is something that's totally unnecessary, and yet I still want people to suffer and not get what they want. Well, that's not very plausible, but it needs to be built up in a certain way. So, big takeaway from today is just that particularly those of us, I think, who've been fortunate enough to discover Ayn Rand's ideas and to get clarity from them, particularly, I should say, it's not just enough to discover them, but to the extent that you have independently understood them yourself and can really clarify the world with them, like, that's just an unbelievable thing, and that's something that you can really use to help others get clarity. But the way to do it is you need to use ideas based on the context of the other person. So you generally want to start with ideas that are relatively easy to understand, and then build to ideas that are harder to understand. So the human flourishing framework has been my way of doing it with industrial and environmental issues, but I hope that you formulate your own framework to do it with the issues that you care about. Thank you very much. Oh, 15 minutes, okay. So we got 15 minutes for Q&A, and then also, yeah, if you want any information, well, let me ask, I don't know who has the answer to this, but do we have pins for people, or did we just give cards?
The cards and pins are, so the cards are in everyone's seats.
Uh-huh.
If you'd like a pin, in exchange for a card, they will be at the registration desk.
Okay, the I Love Fossil Fuels pin. You don't technically need to, you can take a pin even if you don't fill out a card, but that's our general baseline trade. Any questions?
I'll ask one about how selfishness may or may not come up in your discussion. So, do people ever get to a certain point in the conversation where they say, oh, human flourishing, that's just selfishness, isn't that what you're advocating? And do you get some resistance at some point because of that?
Well, does that exact thing come up? I mean, you can almost think of it, almost the best metaphor for this is like focusing a lens. So you can think of it as, but we have a lot of other uses for the term focus, but you can think of it like human flourishing helps you clarify these issues to a certain extent, but it's not sufficient. So at the level, what it's saying is human flourishing is the people who believe in that are the people who say that sort of human life is important. So in part, it's human life versus non-human life, that they're saying primary value should be placed on that, and that they have this idea of that for human life to benefit has this integration of a material and a mental component. And then the idea is it's a kind of broader school of thought that there are different interpretations of. And so the way it is I'll say, well, my interpretation of human flourishing, and the one that I think is ultimately the one that is the only one that allows human beings to flourish as individuals, and that can allow all human beings to flourish, is, and I'd say it includes things like rights and self-interest. So, but it's not like I'm afraid of that. It's not like I'm trying to hide selfishness. And someone said, oh, well, you're in favor of selfishness. Like, oh, no, the jig is up. Like, it's just a matter of what is going to be clarifying to the person. Like, what is the order of explanation that will be most clarifying? If they bring up selfishness, then I'll focus on that. But when it goes well, there's kind of a progression where it's like all the pieces fall into place. And then I remember in particular, I was on a long car ride with someone, which was just, the most convenient way for me to travel was one of the employees of a place to drive me. And I just remember in particular, like, just all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. So by the end of it, when I was talking about selfishness, it was just the most natural thing in the world. Like, you almost couldn't object to it. Whereas if I had begun that car ride with it, it would have just raised so many questions.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein, for both your talk and the incredible work you do.
Oh, thank you.
So a question on framing and strategy.
Okay.
Besides my primary purpose here of learning and refreshing, I also have an issue that I'm looking to bring to other objectivists I regard as crucial, complex, and perhaps not controversial, but misunderstood.
Okay.
So the issue I'm facing is that it's an enormously complex issue.
Well, are you going to tell us what the issue is?
I can, but the question first, if I may.
Okay.
So in regards to speaking to a crowd or individuals with broadly shared premises, I'm having a lot of trouble, given the complexity, finding the best points of framing, let's say, the best points of entry, identifying and running with the motivation that I can find, without it seeming to be floating or pointless concretes. My question to you is, regarding your own process, how do you begin sorting out the complexities of your issues in regards to your audience, and identifying those most likely areas?
Okay, you've intrigued me about what I need to know what the issue is.
I like to introduce it as Ragnar's gold, but you would know it as Bitcoin.
Oh, okay. So it'd be easier to, because I was actually, my friend Eric Dennis introduced Bitcoin to me as a concept, I remember, in 2011, and he had a good way of doing it, so I should try to reconstruct that. It's hard to say in general, because the first thing is that as much as possible, I want to focus on my own clarity, so it's, how do you go, I don't know how you go about it. So it's easier for me to think of now with a new issue, but in general, what I need to know is I need to know what is the context necessary to understand the conclusion. And usually, so it's, and I have a couple of talks on this online, one on intellectual persuasion. So that talk, I give some discussions of what I call context bridging, which is I think of it as you start, the person is at context A, that's where they are, and then you want to bring them to context B. And so what are the key premises to get them there? But there are certain things that you need to add and certain things that you need to subtract and certain things that you need to modify. And it's often that people believe things in a kind of half-true way from your perspective, and you need to clarify those. So I would identify, and actually I have something which I think you can find online. In my OCON talk, I mentioned it. I'll actually, if you're on the mailing list, if you sign up for the mailing list, I'll just send it out there so people can get it. So there's not confusion. It's called the Extreme Clarity Tool, and that's one way of trying to help people context bridge. So I would ask just, what are the key points of context that somebody actually needs to know given their starting context? See, in their starting context, you have to know. That's telling you what you have to work with and what you have to work against. So what do they agree with you that you can build on? And then what do you think they're confused about or they think they know and they're wrong that you need to go against? So just with Bitcoin, if I were trying to work it out, the first thing would just be I would want to know what's the conclusion, what's point B, and then what are the key steps to getting there? And a lot of that would be analyzing where are they starting.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering kind of what your take was on and how you would approach and react to someone who wouldn't even acknowledge human flourishing as a good thing. Because I could start to use, there's a couple kids around my age who talk like complete nihilists, even though it's very obvious from the way they act and the fact that they just got Starbucks that they're not, and it's, but they're acting like, oh yeah, humans are just a complete cancer on the earth, we're worth nothing, like human flourishing, why would that be a good thing? We should just leave nature alone. How would you even approach that, or would you even approach that? Was that a point where you would just kind of throw your hands up? Or?
Yeah, no. Definitely not. I mean, at a certain point you might, but there's a reason why I'll sometimes focus on the order of, I'll sometimes focus on values last, because sometimes you can only grasp a value if you have a certain view of the way the world works. So for instance, with selfishness, my belief in selfishness is based on my belief that human beings are producers, and so we can all benefit in harmony with one another. We don't have to sacrifice. But if somebody doesn't have that context, and that doesn't take me too long to explain, but if they don't have that context, then it's not fully coherent or persuasive that I believe in selfishness. And so the same thing is very true. It's true of humans in general, that if people think that human beings are polluter parasites by nature, that we have an earth that was very nurturing, and then we by our nature screw it up when we try to benefit, then then they're not going to be against human flourishing because they'll actually think human flourishing is impossible, and they'll call it unsustainable. So they'll think, oh, you're trying to flourish. You're trying to benefit, and you're trying to, fly planes and do all these different things, but it's inevitably going to crash. And then what they'll say is, well, the actual policy, the actual sustainable policy is, there need to be a lot fewer of us, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing when I'm talking about human flourishing to people is I want to get a feel of what do they think is the relationship between human beings and our environment? And I'll often focus on, hey, wait a second, the environment isn't perfect, doesn't start out as perfect. We need to transform it. And in fact, overall, we've made it a much better place, and we can continue to. So that's one kind of thing to get. Another kind of thing with human flourishing is, so sometimes they have wrong assumptions that make them against the value. Often, this also applies to selfishness, they don't have, their default definition of the thing is going to be off. So they'll think of human flourishing as human beings against the environment. So it's like, oh, we don't care about anything around us. And so part of what I need to do is specify, no, I mean, we have a good environment, like, well, I want to be safer from climate, and I want to have clean air and clean water, but I want, in effect, the best combination of all of these things for human beings to be well off. So often it's that they have a caricature of it, and so I need to give my own concept. And then another thing is that they're often they don't have ideas very concrete, so they won't focus, like they're not, and the Starbucks thing is an example where it's just disintegrated. And so often what I'll try to find is an example that's very clear cut, to try to isolate the principle. So for example, you're talking to young people, but I would put hey, if I had to choose, between you and, there's a wild dog that's about to kill you, and I can, we can shoot the dog or let the dog kill you, is it legitimate for us to shoot the dog? Or if there are two dogs, should we definitely just let them eat you? Because they're both hungry and they'll be happy, and there's just one of you, right? If you can isolate the issue, because they want to blend together. People just always want to blend together issues. So they want to act like there's no such question of do you choose humans or somebody else, because they'll just say, well, it's all interrelated and you can't separate it out. And if you take one hair off a polar bear, then that's going to somehow harm you. And that's not how anything works. But you want to isolate. No, if it was just those two rabid dogs versus you, should I save your life? And then if they say no, and I say, then I have a final thing, which is I'll just say, well, then if I'm talking about fossil fuels, I'll just say, well, then you should definitely be against fossil fuels, because the only reason to be good for fossil fuels is they make people's lives really good. And so if you want to kill humans, then you should definitely be against fossil fuels. But you can understand why I will fight you on that.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Good question.
Thank you for your talk. I think you kind of touched on my question, but my question is, so human flourishing is very human-centric.
Yes.
With climate change and, let's say global impact, all that stuff, is there a way to be pro-human flourishing, but also be conscious and aware of our fellow animal counterparts? And how does that tie into intelligently improving the world, the earth?
Yeah, so definitely. So it's often one of the caricatures of being pro-human is that it means being anti-other species. And it's somewhat related to the caricatures of selfishness, which means that it's being anti-others. Now with selfishness, it's actually you're in a certain way pro-others in that you wish others the best and that you can be in harmony with them, even though you yourself won't benefit from dealing with all others. But and there's some truth of that with nature, but there's definitely a lot of non-truth with that. So there are definitely huge specific conflicts of interest between me and a lot of other species, including even if I was a vegan, which I'm not, but plants that I want to eat, right? There's a certain kind of conflict, it's a direct conflict of interest between those. So what the key thing that a human flourishing focus says is we want the relationship with nature that's most beneficial for humans. So and I think that's a helpful way of thinking of it, is that you want a relationship that's beneficial. So it doesn't, it's not Now, and that relationship can be killing, and that relationship can be preserving more than it would be naturally preserved in all sorts of things. Like I have a dog, Sherlock, and he is completely an artificial creation, and I have a disproportionate amount of my effort toward preserving him, because he's our dog, versus what I would have for, just about any other species. So it's my relationship with the rest of nature. I'm basing that on my own flourishing. I think in general, human beings should do it. So you are absolutely aware of it, of how other things interrelate with you, but you have to be actually aware of how they actually relate versus this idea that, oh, it's a delicate balance. Anything that we change is going to this just false view of the delicate nurture. And a good resource on this, I think, is I had a podcast where I interviewed a guy named Patrick Moore, who he was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, and he had a PhD in ecology. And he's the only pro-human ecologist I know, so that might be worth a listen to get a sense. And even his Twitter is really interesting, because he'll say he just has a pro-human bent to him, and so he'll just talk about like, oh yeah, well, when I was in Greenpeace, I loved throwing glass bottles off the boat because I knew it would provide like a fun little home for these for like certain little animals. And so he doesn't have this view that, oh, everything human beings do is opposed to the rest of nature, nor does he have that, oh, it's all in harmony, but he tries to have a very specific understanding of how the world works, and then he's trying to optimize for humans.
Thank you.
All right, last question.
Yeah, this will be a quick one. I was thinking yesterday, of how the distinction between man-made and natural is almost it's just invalid in some ways, because it's man is nature or part of nature.
Is it going to be a short question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the short question is, have you ever made the case oh, you're against man-made? Well, what about bird-made? Should nests all go too? And beaver-made? Do you think that?
Yeah, I think this is a very powerful line of thought that I've partially developed, and I want to develop more. And there's just a lot there. So one of my favorite ways to get at this point is I'll say that if Martians were viewing us on Earth, they wouldn't say we're unnatural. They'd say we make the best nests, right? That's, you don't want it to be, so there's a real danger. So I really like your question, and it'll make me think about it more, because it's very important to not be anti-nature. And so, but it's hard to get the right concept, because it's really man-made versus non-man-made, and that's kind of a mouthful to say non-man-made. So but it's definitely the right track. And one other thing I find is very helpful is to observe that, hey, people are saying their premise is that anything that human beings make is considered unnatural and bad, and anything else that the rest of nature makes is natural and good. So they're saying, we are the only bad part of, they're saying anything, so I have two ways of doing this. So one is that they're saying anything made by humans, the human race is bad, so they're human racists. So that's one way to get at it, right? So there is human racism, and I at some point may write that book. And the other one is that what is the, and this is a total Ayn Rand point, but what is the distinction between man-made and non-man-made? It's that man-made things are made by a mind. So to be against the man-made is to be against the mind-made. And that really upsets people, but it's very true. Yeah. So thank you for having me. I'm going to be around at the banquet tonight if anyone wants to say hi, and maybe for a few minutes now, but it's always fun to be here. And thanks, Craig and Sarah, for inviting me.